Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is certainly good to be here. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Mud City. Yeah, nailed it. Okay, so we're gonna continue with the story of the arches in this medallion here. It was having discussed the possibility of this being a bell and what that could mean in a symbolic nature. Um, you know, and when you think about the domes that are on top, they are bells, right? And the way they work. And there's so many videos out there that demonstrate how these domes capture sound and, and the way they work, the resonance and everything. So that was a great observation by Secret Subscriber. And, Fixin' Time had a great one as well with the flag and everything. And, when I found the date, 1814, tying this all into the War of 1812, made me realize how much, is being told in this one, just this one seal, this one medallion, right? And I knew I could use it to, for further episodes down the line, trying to think ahead in terms of my show, right? And, so now I've got the 215th anniversary of the Battle of Baltimore coming up. So, 1 Arches 8, chapter 3 or 4 will be that. And then Flag Day for Mary Young Pickersgill and her flag, and the whole Liber and Libertas and the Columbia aspect of it will come in. Maybe a little bit with this one, but definitely when I get into the B&O Railroad building across the street from here, and the Lady of Elk, or however you want to say that. So let's go. Here we go. Let's go with the War of 1812 and what we can figure out about the War of 1812 and the destruction of Washington, D.C. and how none of this seems right. This War of 1812, there's something not right about it. And so let's go with it. So the nation is young and it needs a capital. And I'm not going to go into the whole, Daniel Carroll provided the land, and I'm going to get into that when I get back into the Carrolls and all of that. The season 2, the way I envisioned it, did not really sort of happen. But that stuff will happen because I have been reading about it, and it is absolutely amazing what the Calverts and the Carrolls and things were doing, right? It's unbelievable. So that stuff will happen, but I'm glad so much other interesting stuff is happening as well, like finding this archway. Pardon me. So they talk about. Let's talk about the establishment of the capital, all right? So we all know that, prior to the Revolutionary War and right after the Revolutionary War, the capital was in Philadelphia, all right? The First and Second Continental Congress was there, and the Congress of the Confederation was there. But in 1783, an angry mob of soldiers converged on Independence Hall to demand payment for their service during the war. So the new government, ripped off the soldiers, didn't pay them. That sounds like a familiar story, right? Not taking care of those who fought for you, right? And so Congress requests that John Dickinson, the governor of Pennsylvania, calls a militia to defend Congress from these protesters. But that's kind of a curious thing, because where's the militia going to come from? Who's paying them? Why would they defend you? If you didn't pay soldiers who fought for you, why would another militia come in to defend you? And so, rightly so, John Dickinson decides in the favor of the protesters, right, in this Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783. And so the Congress was forced to flee to Princeton, right? In 1783. And so when they were writing the Constitution afterwards, I mean, it doesn't talk about it, so clearly there's 4 years or so between the Philadelphia Convention when they write the Constitution. So somehow there was a resolution. They don't say what it is, but they don't forget. They didn't forget what happened. And so when they were writing the Constitution, they in Section 8 created the independent capital, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. And so, so Article 1 really establishes what the government is, the different houses of the government, the House of Representatives, the Senate, right? How laws are made, things of that nature. States' rights are addressed, and so, each section kind of has its own little thing. And then we get to Section 8, right? And Section 8 does everything. I mean, it absolutely sets up, total control, right? It gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes and tariffs for I love this, that it's in quotes, general welfare of the United States, right? The power to borrow money, right? The power to regulate interstate and international commerce, the power to set naturalization laws, right? The power to coin and regulate money, the power to establish federal courts inferior to the Supreme Court. So that's interesting. Right? The power to raise and support military forces, the power to create the Army and the Navy, right here. The power to declare war. And the exclusive power to establish a federal district. And this is the thing, because they remember what happened. They remembered getting chased out of Philadelphia in 1783. They said, we're going to create our own place, and we're going to wield absolute control over you with our fancy laws. And what are you going to do about that? Not much you're going to be able to do about that, because wouldn't you know it, these Brits are still hanging around, and there happens to be a small faction of senators and so forth who, aren't sure the Revolutionary War played out the way that it should have. They might be a little bit wise to what the Carols and some of the people in Boston and New York and Philadelphia were up to, right? Because that's really the way it sort of plays out. And so there was this group that got nicknamed the War Hawks, right? And the War Hawks were very suspect of Britain, and they were itching. They wanted to go back to war with Britain. And there was about a dozen members of the 12th Congress, which is interesting, right? There's no coincidence there, 12 and 12, right? And the leader of the group was Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who just was in my last one, right? So he now has my attention, and I'm going to be looking into him more at some time down the line. Maybe he'll find his way into an update video. I gotta start on those too. Jeez Louise. So these guys were still kind of itching for war, but the northern states, not so much. But Madison was feeling the heat from these guys and from some of the other southern states, and he wanted a piece of Canada because expansion was happening, and Jefferson had just scored big with the Louisiana Purchase before him, and he was getting into Madison, we're talking about now, is getting into his second term. And so the War of 1812, so all of that's happening, but Britain all the while still has its massive empire, and doesn't the way it's kind of presented to me and the way my intuition reads it is that Britain didn't really, like the U.S. was still kind of a nuisance more than anything after the Revolutionary War, and they liked to nuisance the U.S. And they would, commandeer U.S. ships and enslave the crew, and they would openly enlist freed slaves and escaped slaves into their military, and, they definitely needled the new country of the United States, and, and the U.S., like I said, they were looking to get into Canada, so they used some of this as provocation of war. They created some false flag stuff and were able to declare war with England, because like I said, they wanted into Canada. They won't. And my joke is they wanted the star forts that were up there. We know there's star forts up there. We've got the intel. We're part of those charter companies. Back in the day, we had our connections in there. The Calverts know. We want them. And Britain was like, no, you can't have them. There are star forts. And, that's kind of the way this went. And that's my joke about it, tying it all into the mud flood and the star forts and everything. And, so we go to war, right? But in the meantime, after the Constitution is ratified, right, and the state of the area of Washington D.C. is established, right? So that's we're talking 1790, right? And so that's when the building is happening. That's when the new Capitol building and the White House and the Treasury and what other, name your government building, whatever they're building at the time, that's when it's happening, right? And this War of 1812 comes about, just 20 years into the building, right? And they mention when the sacking, when they burned D.C. to the ground, so to speak, they talk about the Capitol building isn't even completed yet at that point. And it's interesting because we're going to go forward. We're going to see how long it actually takes them to complete this Capitol building. It takes them forever, So now, the thing about the War of 1812, and there's some back and forth, but there's not really much, as you can tell, as you might imagine, with the U.S. not paying its soldiers, they don't necessarily have the greatest military force at the time, right? And they lose some battles along the Canadian border, but they do manage to get in and really do a number. They sack York, which is today modern-day Toronto. And the Brits, they don't forget that, right? And because they liked York. And so, of course, like I said, Britain has a whole lot going. They have a whole lot on their plate because they have a huge empire, right? And they're fighting the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon, he surrenders. He calls it a day. And so that frees up a bunch of military for Britain to use against the U.S. And so I brought up now this, Google Earth here, right? And so most of what's happening in this war for the U.S. is happening up here. And it's interesting that is the case, especially with the tie to the Star Forts and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it's also interesting, I hope I mention it, I hope I get to it, with what the British have their Corps of Engineers with them as well. And so hopefully I'll get into that. So most of their stuff is happening up along the Canadian border. And so what happens is the British get smart and they send Rear Admiral George Cockburn right up in here to start wreaking havoc along the Chesapeake Bay. and with the sights set on Washington, D.C. And the thing about it at the time is the government of Washington, the government doesn't really seem to care much about this, even though this is happening for well over a year along up and down Chesapeake, right? And, they don't really seem to care. And so we're going to get into now the burning of Baltimore and what happens. And I'm going to start with this one. I'm going to read a little bit from both, and I'm sorry I am going to repeat some information. But this article is just actually, I love this article, so I'll definitely try to remember to link this one. This is from, ironically enough, the History Channel, promoting fake history, right? And so when the War of 1812 first broke out, the fighting centered on the border between the United States and Canada, right? Just what I was talking about, right? And here's your George Cockburn. He's coming up. And, it's interesting to me, though, that he spent much of 1813 terrorizing the coastal communities of the Chesapeake and then winters in Bermuda, but comes back in February of 14 when it's absolutely the coldest time of year here. I mean, in the Chesapeake, that's the coldest time of year, February, every year. So he built bases and he accepted 4,000 new troops. And so Britain's getting ready to roll right on up on Washington, right? Which is, has very little protection because all the armed forces are to the north, right? And so Madison established a new military district for D.C., but he wanted at least 2,000 U.S. regulars plus a reserve of militiamen, 10 to 12,000 strong, right? And think about that statement when you think this is 22 years, so maybe 30 years after the Revolutionary War-ish, and they want these young men to serve in their militia when they know that their forefathers, their grandparents, and maybe even some of their fathers did not get paid. I'm sure they were quick to line up, right? Only a small fraction of this force was ever rounded up. And this is interesting here, is because the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, insisted until the last possible moment that the British would not attack the capital. Not even an anonymous letter detailing Cockburn's invasion plans spurred the administration to action, nor a plea from Washington's mayor, who called the city defenseless. Right, so this guy's been up and down the Chesapeake for more than a year, and Washington does nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. That is crazy suspect to me, right? And especially, because what's coming, it gets even crazier. So it's unprotected, right? And so meanwhile, there are some forces trying to gather, but not much. And so the British just keep moving up the Patuxent River, right? And they get close enough finally that a makeshift scouting party led by Secretary of State James Monroe goes out to check on how big it could be. But, Jimmy Monroe forgot his spyglass, right? So they could not gauge the size of the invading force. How convenient. We can't tell how big it is. I don't even think we even need to be out here. They're not coming here. And there is small precedent for this, although in that, historically speaking, capitals are occupied and not sacked. They're not razed, right? Capitals typically are occupied. So they may be kind of a little too sure of themselves here in that regard, but none of this story smells right at all. I mean, the capital is just there, there for the taking, right? And so they talk about all these troops that arrive, and there was one, they briefly exchange fires, but so the Americans had to blow up they blew up their own boats, right? Instead of having them captured, right? And As they drew closer, the residents of Washington began to depart en masse, and the clerks began whisking important papers out of town, such as the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is an interesting statement, because they say important papers like the Declaration of Independence, so we're going to talk about what papers could mean coming up in just a moment. And so, it took a couple of days, but imagine still, even though, we have 4 days notice here, right, from when Monroe goes out to check on the progress of the British invasion force, right, on August 20th. So August 24th, right, we have this Battle of Bladensburg, right, in which the British, after marching 15 miles in the heat, 6,000 strong, they're exhausted. It gets hot, in this area in August, right, and humid. Oh my God, right, and so they marched all this way, and some of them fell victim to sunstroke. Yet when they charged over the bridge at the Americans, the militiamen started fleeing almost immediately. That's how ill-prepared and how little resistance the Americans were prepared to give, guarding its capital. Right? That's unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable, right? And but even still, they want to, they're still going to have a party at the White House, right? And so, but now we're going to get into a little bit of, here they come, right? And the British are hell-bent on revenge for Toronto, York, right? And so when they get there, the first stop is the Capitol, the still uncompleted Capitol building, where they pile up furniture in both the House and Senate wings, mixed in rocket powder and applied the torch. Flames were shooting throughout the windows within minutes, right, is what it says, and damaging not only the congressional chambers, but the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court. And this is what I mean about papers and the Library of Congress. And, so they save the Declaration of Independence, of course, because that's handy for the narrative that they want to spin. But, of course, we know that right out of Baltimore, and with all the lawyering that's been going on in Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania and New York since the mid-1600s, Boston, and since the mid-1600s, perhaps all of that lawyering, all that crafty handiwork and paperwork that these guys were doing, which sets up this independent nation, but only still under the control of the crown. All the precedent that they need to create, the Constitution and so forth. A lot of these papers, I'm thinking, get lost, get burned in this Library of Congress, and they only saved the ones that were pertinent to the narrative they needed going forward, and all the ones that helped them get that far needed to be gone, right? And so this whole sacking of Washington, D.C. seems to me to be the deliberate erasure of the faking of the American Revolution. That's what it looks like to me, just on the surface here. And so they burn all these buildings, and I have a presentation. I'm going to show some of the stuff, some of the damage, a little bit later. The Treasury building was also burned. And this is an interesting statement, although much to their disappointment, the British found no money inside. And so this makes me wonder, I skipped ahead. Right, so when they got to the White House, like I said, they were going to have a party when this invading force was miles outside the White House doorstep. They were setting to have a party, right? And they had to run. Oh my God, they're coming! They're that close. How could they be this close? They were only 4 days away. They were only that. How could you rationalize this? How is this possible? So the British show up and they eat all the party food, and they ransack the place, and they start burning it down, and then they go to the Treasury building, but they say they found no money. And so this is interesting to me, is that maybe what the true important paperwork was the money that was in there, and that's lost forever, and it didn't go to the American people. Or on the other side, when Cockburn gets there, he pockets all the money, and when the crown comes looking for it and says, "Hey man, how much money was in that treasury. He says, wouldn't you know it? It was empty. Couldn't believe it. He and his men kept all that money, right? But either way, it didn't come back to the American people, right? And so they just kept the destruction coming, and the Americans destroyed their own naval yard. They set fire to it, right? Along with the British torched the remains of the naval yard, because when they got that close, the Americans torched the naval yard. But then they also the brick homes of the state, war, and navy departments. Everything about the military, any sort of historical records, you have to imagine. So what could possibly have been lost? And only certain things were saved. All of this is a giant cover-up. There's no doubt about it, man. I mean, how could it be anything else? That's what I want to know. They smashed the presses of the newspapers and so forth, right? And so let me go back now. I'm going to... there was one thing in here. I must have skipped over some stuff, because now there's stories I wanted to tell that I didn't get to tell. Oh, this was great. For the Battle of Bladensburg, right, President Madison witnessed this, right? This is what he said. I could never have believed that so great a difference existed between regular troops and a militia force. If I had not witnessed the scenes of this day, Madison purportedly said, that is absolutely hilarious. Oh geez, just handing a rifle to a guy off the street is not going to be as good as a trained military. Absolutely genius. All right, and then one other story is about Dolly Madison, Madison's wife, who insisted that this full-length portrait of George Washington be saved, and I didn't bring that up. I'm surprised. Oh, maybe it comes up in this other one. Because, like I said, I did want to cross-reference these, and so I'm not going to go through it all again. But there was a big storm. This is what I want to talk about. Less than a day after the attack began. So they did all of this damage in a day. They razed all of these buildings, burned them down. They brought their own, I think I missed it, but they did. They brought in their own Royal Corps of Engineers to help in the destruction of the American capital, right? Interesting that they felt they needed the Corps of Engineers for that. But a huge storm, a hurricane with a tornado that lifts a cannon and kills British troops and American civilians, right? Which is amazing, right? And so the British, after the storm, hightail it out of there, and they call the storm that saved Washington, but it actually caused more damage, because the British didn't really do much damage to only if civilian homes were firing on them did they do anything to civilian homes. They went after government buildings strictly. They were under orders. Right? And so let's see if they go into hold on now. Yes, okay. So I want to talk about this, right? First Lady Dolly Madison received a letter from her husband urging her to be prepared to leave Washington at a moment's notice. But it's interesting, right? Didn't they just say they were preparing for a party? How is he sending her a letter, yet they're preparing for a party? Or maybe he sees that they're coming and the party they're planning it that far in advance. But it seems almost like the stories are weird. Did the British come in and the table was already set, or were just everything was stocked, the kitchen was stocked, and the cabinets were stocked, and it was ready to go for a party yet to come? A little unclear there. Right? But so she wanted to save this portrait of George Washington, and I really, just for time's sake, I'm not going to get into all of that now, but I did want to talk about this real quick because this is interesting. James Madison's personal slave, the 15-year-old boy, Paul Jennings. Now, it's interesting that his last name is Jennings, and famously, Thomas Jefferson's slave mistress was Sally Jennings, right? And so I'm thinking maybe perhaps Paul Jennings is Thomas Jefferson's son, one of his children, right? All right. So he transferred. It says here, I guess, from Madison to Daniel Webster, right? And so he published a White House memoir, Colored Man's Reminiscence of James Madison. So very interesting, right? He was a mixed race, and let's see. So as a mixed race, and as a slave, right, he made many useful connections, was aided by Daniel Webster, right? Traveled to Virginia, let's see. Let's see. Let's start here, right? So Jennings was born into slavery in Montpelier in 1799. His mother was African Native American, enslaved by the Madisons. Interesting, otherwise, actually put under contract for work, perhaps. She told the boy his father was Benjamin Jennings, an English trader. Told the boy, right? Perhaps maybe the boy's father was James Madison. I don't know. The mixed race slave was raised as a child and was a companion to Dolly's son, Payne Todd. It's interesting that it says Dolly's son. I wonder if that's not Madison's kid. I wonder if that's kind of interesting. Right? And he began to serve Madison as a footman and later was trained as a body servant, so as a bodyguard. Right? So, interesting connection there, I thought. And so I thought that was a little interesting side story there. And especially with the Jennings connection, it could be Thomas Jefferson's kid. It could be James Madison's kid. Who knows, right? So now Washington has been totally sacked and burned. And I wanted to discuss this story real quick because Rear Admiral Cockburn had help in the form of the Corps of Colonial Marines. And now when I mentioned earlier that part of the way that England was sort of needling the newly formed U.S. was by enlisting free slaves and escaped slaves, right? And this was their duty, right? The Corps of Colonial Marines, right? And this is what they wore, and when they were in battle, they wore the red coat, just like regular infantrymen, right? And it's pretty interesting that that they were a big help in they were a big part of the raising of Washington D.C. Given the fact that Washington D.C. was actually very friendly to the free black, to the free slave, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. Oh, and I see that I need to bring up my other slides. But there was a regiment of there was two regiments, but the second one was the one that helped Cockburn in the Chesapeake Theater. But there was a regiment of them called the Black Refugees, right? And I love this this picture here, right? Gabriel Hall, only known image of black Nova Scotian who migrated to the colony during the War of 1812. So ostensibly he was one of the Corps of Colonial Marines, right? And he's clearly in his later years, but it's interesting because the way they fake history, right? Could be just like they just grabbed this guy off the street and it's like, okay, we're gonna take your picture. You were a member of the Corps of Colonial Marines. I did what now? It's like, we're just gonna take your picture, guy. Here's a bottle. I mean, you don't know. I mean, it could be that, I hate to say it that way, but it could be that simple, So, but one thing about them is, after the war, they got to settle. They were free people, right? They were part of they were Britons now, right, or Englishmen, or however whatever their new, however they chose to identify with now, but they were given these opportunities, and I wanted to talk about this real quick. They were involved in now where did it go? Is it over here? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I think it's over here. So the Corps of Colonial Marines, they got to settle out, right? And they were involved in here we go, post-war developments. They were involved in something called the Battle of Negro Fort, and I just wanted to show you. This is under in Spanish Florida, right? This is just a part of the war. But look at that star fort, right? So connecting the idea of star forts, like I did a joke earlier about the Canadian star forts, but there was one in Florida, and I'm absolutely certain that the star fort here connects with the ones that they have along, the Canadian border, and and Fort McHenry and DC and so forth. I mean, there's really, the star forts play a factor in these early American wars, and it's really, these wars are kind of put in the history books to cover up what was going on and what could possibly have been happening with those star forts. At least that's certainly what it looks like to me. And I wanted to do, and so I have to bring it up here real quick. I forgot to bring this up. Was come on. Okay, so so Washington was sacked, right? And now, of course, it needs to be rebuilt. And I know I've been going on this one a little too long, so I'm not going to go into all of it. But there was debate about where the capital should be moved to, if it should be moved, should it stay in D.C. And of course, they created another article amendment or whatever to keep Washington where it is. But this is the man that they hired to rebuild Washington, right? And his name is Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And an interesting thing about him is that, they call him one of the first formally trained professional architects in the new United States, which I think is interesting, right? So they were all amateur architects building things, for the first, 150 years of the country. But he's a major player. Right. Oh, and look, Charles Wilson Peel. I blew it on his name. I called him Pierce, just because I hadn't thought about him in a while, and I was, just, doing my freewheeling thing, and but this Peel guy is, a big part of, the whole you know, mass creation of portraits and teaching a style of simple art that you could, create portraits to put in the narrative for future generations to look at, right? And hope that nobody notices the difference in professional styles from one artist to another and so forth, he's a big part of that, and he's the reason we have museums today. Look into him if you've never looked into him. I'm sure I'll get back to him someday. But anyway, so he's the architect for the basilica, the first Roman Catholic cathedral, and he is also, I gotta look up this picture real quick. What? Oh. He's also the designer of this building here, which is an amazing building. Look at the size of this thing, right? And I'm not going to go forward with it again for time's sake, but I believe my memory serves they tore it down in 1901 or something like that. Of course, but I couldn't find a picture of it. This is the only illustration I could find of it. So major player in terms of the architecture of the day, and putting forward the narrative of this, all these, neo-Roman styles that they call, they have so many different names for them. It's hard to keep track. So he becomes an important player, and so. So that kind of sums up the story there, right? With the medallion and the kind of the story of the sacking of Washington D.C. and what possibly could have been going on there. It seems to me to be a definite whitewashing of American history of that, or certainly of the Revolutionary and the early formation of our governments. Who knows what kind of important papers were lost? So many damaging, and who knows where all that money went and so forth. The whole thing stinks. It stinks to high heaven. And it's interesting that they gave us things like the national anthem to come out of it, maybe to keep us from looking at it, right? Oh yeah, that was the war that was the tie, right? It was a military stalemate, but we got our national anthem out of it, and who cares about the War of 1812? But it definitely bears closer inspection. And it definitely, there's definitely so much more to come out of this one medallion, this one seal. And so I'm going to be continuing on. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to find some other topics to go on. I will come back to this one down the line, like I said, with the anniversaries of the Battle of Baltimore, maybe Flag Day. I don't know. But I wanted to close it out with this sort of picture tour of Washington, D.C. real quick. And these are all images before it was a city, and they do have images of the Reconstruction in here, which is what kind of is pertinent about it. And so I thought these old images were cool, and I thought it would be a cool way to close out this presentation. So here we have the White House for Easter 1926, right? Not the most widely attended thing in the world, I mean, really, this doesn't look to be all that many people, maybe a few hundred at most. And there's a lot of stuff to read, and I'm not going to get into that. But here's a nice picture of it as as undeveloped, right? We got a nice steamboat painting here. Don't worry, it gets better. All right, here's the first city plan by Pierre Lafont that I did not discuss in this video. Here's the Capitol building. So the two houses are here, right, connected by a hallway. Um, you know, and so this is a digital rendering of the U.S. Capitol as it would have looked in 1814. Right? So they burned this thing to the ground, right? But it's interesting, though, like how there's absolutely nothing around it anywhere, right? How far do they have to go to get lunch? I mean, and we know that these buildings weren't built with bathrooms and stuff. Is that what this stuff is out here? And it doesn't look like it. There's no any chimneys or anything on it. So what was happening in these buildings? Very, very sort of interesting observations there. Um, is this where the outhouses and stuff were? um, so I think that's kind of an interesting painting, right? And then this is a shot of the early 1900s, right? And look how, again, it's the same thing with all these old city photographs from just about every city all over the world, right? I mean, where is everybody? This is our nation's capital. You can, there's not a lot of people on these streets, and they appear to be dirt, but they do have some train tracks in here, so there's trolley system or something. And I like that there's no like cable or anything, so it's either using an electric rail on the ground or it's pulling its electricity from the air, right? Because I highly doubt they're throwing coal steam trains down the middle of this whatever street this is in Washington, D.C. with all that soot and smoke and stuff. I doubt that's happening in the early 1900s. There's a painting of the burning of the White House. We saw that, right? Here is a picture of the White House circa 1846, right? What's that thing doing up there? It's an interesting photograph, and I see all this whiteness, and you don't know what could possibly be manipulated. Look at this here. Who knows what they could possibly be. I don't trust any of these images really. Here's the Eckington Yards for the B&O Railroad in 1923, and again, it's a massive railroad yards. But there's so few people and so little activity, it seems to be happening here. And when I see this sort of fogginess over here and this blanched out brightness, who's to say that that's not tampered with? I don't know. This is great. This is a construction of the Treasury, 1858. All right, is this a construction photo? And so this is interesting too. Like here's the oxen, pulling the bricks, but I don't really see like brickwork like this going on. Maybe that's what they're doing down here. I mean, I have no idea what's going on with this thing. They got these cables. What's that all about, right? But again, some weird staining, and I don't know what could be going on with some of these photographs. I mean, I'm not trusting these old photographs the way that I used to could. And here's one from 1860. The Capitol still isn't done yet, but Latrobe had the design, and I'll get into it in another time when I get into Latrobe fully. And again, I always want to leave room for reinvestigation, so I always want to have some things open. So it's curious that so many years after the War of 1812, or the sacking of D.C. in 1814, we're talking, 46 years later, it's still not done. Look at this picture. How suspect is this picture, right? With all of this, none of this looks right, None of it at all. I'm not buying it. I'm sorry. There's a great bridge here. I'm not going to linger on that one too much. There's a snowstorm. People shoveling snow into horse-drawn carriages to haul away. Doesn't seem like the most effective way to do it to me, but I guess it makes a little bit of sense. But look, the streetcars are going here, right in the 1910s. They don't seem to have much of a problem. You know, it's not like today they shut you down before a flake even falls. I thought this was a very interesting photograph of Lincoln's funeral procession, right? You know, and look, I mean, it's not the most, I mean, you would think everyone would be flocking in, especially when you read the report of the national conventions, the political conventions in Baltimore, drawing like 200,000 in a tiny little section of town. You would think that this would be, and that's what's funny too about like the Zapruder film with Kennedy. You know, you would think there would be more people hanging around to watch the president drive by back then. You know, I don't know. You know, the president seemed to me like it would be a much bigger deal in 1963 than it is today, and even that much bigger deal in 1860, whatever this was, 6, you know, 5, 4, whatever. Here's the Washington Monument allegedly under construction, and I like this. This is sort of implying that it's built from the inside, and they built the bricks. They hoist them up like 1 brick at a time or something, 2 bricks at a time. That's not a very big harness here. You know, I don't know what's happening here in this foreground. But again, another very sort of strange picture. I know it's not strange, but I mean, it kind of looks like, well, you know, I've seen some woodcuts, alleged woodcuts that look more photorealistic than this. I've seen tattoos that look more photorealistic than this, you know. Here's a city plan for 1901. I don't know if this incorporates the owl or is incorporated in the owl. I'm not going that far back. I love this shot. This is a good shot of D.C. from the air in 1910 because it does give at least a small impression of what this area could have possibly looked like under the rule of the previous civilization, right? Because it's kind of sparse, right? And there's open spaces and the buildings are big, right? It does kind of lend an air of that to me when I look at this. Like, this may be something what it looked kind of like a little bit what it may have looked like, right? I don't know, just my imagination, I guess. And they talk about demolishing slums, right? This is a picture of a slum, but to me, you know, I mean, this could be good living in Baltimore today, right? And they call this an alley dwelling, right? 1941, right? And I don't know, for 1941, this is not the best picture in the world. But I think it's interesting. There's an upside down pentagram in it. And these stars on the side of buildings, if you ever see them in these row homes, and there are row houses in, you know, most older American cities, that's support. They're the beams that go from front to back, and sometimes they had big stars to anchor them to the brick in front. That's the significance of the star, although I don't think that one is. They did become decorative after a while. But interesting that this one's upside down. Some are, some aren't, you know. I think it just might be the way they fit best to the wall, but you never know. They're always telling stories, right? Yeah. I'm sure that there's a lot going on. This picture has depth too. You know, look at the layers. I mean, this photo isn't an accident. You know, someone with keener eyes could probably pull a lot out of that. And I love, like, you know, all the streets are dirt, but the streetcars are all open windowed. You know. Nobody's worried about breathing in dirt, you know, dust or getting dirty at all, you know. I love that aspect of it. You know, and I don't know if this is still a case. I didn't follow up on it, but this is the naval, what is this? At the Naval Building Lawn, circa 1910. Look at this. This is the Naval Building. I love this building. I have to know. I mean, I'm not going to do it for this video, but, you know, again, I always want to leave some windows open to come back in, you know. There's just a cow chilling out on the front of the Naval Building lawn. Why? It's just too funny for me. Woodrow Wilson had sheep. You know, he had dozens of them, it says. Dozens of sheep, but we got a picture of one of them. right? And they would auction off the wolf for charity, which is nice, These guys are working to pave the road in DC and I think this is a very interesting picture because of, they're kind of just standing around, which of course, tells me that they're on the clock, definitely. But the contrast here to this, because this road, whatever this is, looks all wet, right? This is wetness, but what they have here looks like dry rock and, gravel, sand or whatever. And like, so where did all this wetness come from? There's no hoses here or anything. And if this is like, hot tarmac that they're laying down for like pavement, this should sort of look like, or this should sort of look like this. This picture is very strange. What caused all of this wetness? I don't know. Kind of weird. All right, and now we're going to get into some trickery and, how they manipulate our history, right? 1919, a group of white residents attacked black residents in 4 days of mob violence, which resulted in 15 deaths and 150 injuries in D.C., right? Now, I don't know if this is the second Ku Klux Klan rose to prominence in the 1920s, right? I want you to look at this picture here. There's so many things wrong about this picture. I mean, starting with these trees back here, right? And the way this is just, I don't know, it just looks placed back in there. And this foreground doesn't seem right coming out of these trees. Like, this looks like a long street. How is it coming out of these trees? Where did this line of trees come from? This photo is an absolute fake. And I want to mention that, in the history, in this one here, and this is why I believe that is a fake, and why I believe that all this racial tension and the problems that we have in this way are completely manipulated and in a very recent time. And that slavery isn't what we were taught it was. It was I don't know. I'm not going to put myself out there too much and say what it was, but pardon me. I will say that I will suggest that it isn't what we were taught it was. And so in the early part of this article here, it says that unique among cities with a high percentage of African Americans, Washington had a significant black population since the city's creation. Since the city's creation, 1791, the city was created. Okay? So a significant black population. It became a center for the African American culture and a center of the civil rights movement, right? And it says since the city government was run by the U.S. federal government, right, black and white school teachers were paid at an equal scale as workers for the federal government, right? The equality. That's what that says. Work equality. In Washington, D.C., from Jump Street, 1790, all right? And it wasn't until Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat, instituted segregation starting in 1913. When was this? This was in 1919, 6 years after Woodrow Wilson segregates the city, which was peacefully cohabitating racially for 100 years, longer, 125 years. The way they divide us, the way they're doing it, and they did it through history, and they sell us this bogus history. And so I just want to try to point some of that stuff out as I find it, and but so that's interesting, so that's my tale of the raising, the shacking of Washington, D.C., the sacking. So that's my tale of the sacking of Washington, D.C., and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had a blast with it. There's so much more to come with this one. Like I said, it'll come in its due time. I think I'm going to move on. I might not jump in just to move away from the Arch a little bit. It's been a bunch of Arch videos in a row, and but I'm having a blast with him. I'm definitely going to come back to it, and uh, I hope you guys are enjoying them. And so until the next one, please take care of yourselves, guys, and each other. And until the next one, cheers, guys.